both to project a little bit, just so my microphone picks it up.
So do you want Eyal Weizman?
Okay.
Weizman. Okay, Eyal, ready to hit it?
Yep.
Okay.
I'll have you both right here. I'll have you take a step this way, just a little bit away from the podium. Both right. So as soon as I go like that, yeah, that's it.
You start? I start?
Do you want to start?
Sure.
Just say.
Hi, I'm Marie Brenner from Vanity Fair, and I'm at the Roy Titus. What's it?
I would just say the Titus One Theater at the Museum of Modern Art. We're about to start this event,
Okay.
and I'm here with, sorry.
Eyal Weizman.
Talk about the event for a minute or two, questions back and forth, and then just say tune in live in 5 minutes on MoMA's YouTube channel. Okay. So,
Hi, everyone. I'm Marie Brenner from Vanity Fair, and I'm in Titus Theater at MoMA for one of the most interesting events that I have ever been asked to moderate. Today, we are talking about nationalism. We're putting it into context. It's a panel for the Jaipur Literary Festival called the Patriot Games, and I'm joined by, among others, the great Eyal Weizman, whose work you surely know. He's the forensic architect of the world. He's an investigative reporter who uses architecture as his medium. Join us live on the MoMA channel to stream. Eyal.
Absolutely, yes. I'm Eyal. I just flew in from Mexico, originally from London via Israel. And I'm going to be speaking about urbanization and urban conflict and the challenge to civil society of how to deal with nationalism, how to counter it via urban architecture.
So join us at 6:30 live on the MoMA channel on YouTube.
You're such a professional.
I was speaking over myself in a kind of nervous way.
No, but I appreciate it. Yeah. You do it. gentleman sitting next to you.
Good evening and welcome to the Museum of Modern Art. Very pleased to have you here as we kick off the fall season. I'm Stuart Comer. I'm Chief Curator for the Media and Performance Art Department here at the museum. And along with my colleague Sean Anderson from the Architecture and Design Department, I help also oversee our group from the CMAP group dedicated to Asia. And in many of the discussions we've had in the CMAP group, which is MoMA's platform for effectively reflecting on a more global set of concerns, but the discussions that we've had in that group inevitably led us to this collaboration with the Jaipur Literary Festival, which, as you know, is the self-proclaimed greatest literary show on earth, and also the largest free event of its kind worldwide. So it's been a tremendous honor for us to be able to embark on this collaboration with them, which began earlier this year in Jaipur, where we also presented a panel in parallel with an ongoing project here at the museum called Citizens and Borders, which arises out of major bodies of work in our collection, ranging from Jacob Lawrence's Migration series to Bouchra Khalili's The Mapping Journey project, which we presented here in the atrium last year, and really trying to focus on what are clearly an increasingly urgent set of questions around nationhood, around citizenship, around the refugees who only continue to proliferate worldwide. So this evening, following the panel in Jaipur, which included two artists that were in Sean Anderson's show on the refugee crisis, Rina Kalat and Tiffany Chung, alongside the Cuban artist Tania Bruguera, whose work we'll be presenting early next year at the museum. Tonight, it's a great pleasure to welcome this very esteemed group of speakers: Urvashi Butalia, Bouchra Khalili herself, Bruce Robbins, and Eyal Weizman in conversation with Marie Brenner. Clearly, nationalism is unfortunately a major issue at the moment as tribalism and the ripple effect of globalization continues to shock us almost daily. I think everyone on this panel tonight will probably have a very unique take on recent events and the longer history leading up to it, so I'm very much looking forward to all of their input. I would particularly like to thank our collaborators at the JLF, Sanjoy Roy and Critic Gupta, and the rest of the Teamwork staff. They're all here prior to their major project in Boulder happening later this month, which you'll hear about at the end of the session this evening. And of course, I'd also like to thank my many colleagues here at MoMA who've helped put this event together, in particular Sean Anderson, Ratan Johal, Sarah Suzuki, Jay Levinson, Sarah Lukowski, Linnea West, and Marta Dancy. The event also would definitely not have happened without the long-term friendship of William Dalrymple, who's the director of the JLF, and our own director, Glenn Lowry, who've been providing ongoing support for this platform and for this collaboration. So on that note, I would really like to offer a warm welcome to Marie Brenner, who is an acclaimed American author and investigative journalist and writer-at-large for Vanity Fair. She's also written for New York Magazine, The New Yorker, and The Boston Herald, and has taught at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. She will introduce our other distinguished speakers, and I would also like to offer a very warm welcome to all of you. I hope you enjoy tonight's discussion. Thank you.
Well, this is a thrill. I'm so honored to be sharing this stage with so many artists and thinkers that I admire, and what better place to launch the Jaipur Festival in New York than the hallowed halls of MoMA, which has been focused on modernism and all of its implications since 1929. Sean, I spent most of my graduate school time right upstairs in the film library, and I thank you for inviting me and to Namita Gokhale and Sanjoy Roy, whose Jaipur Festival is the great carnival of literary democracy of the world. In Jaipur, Indian students from the villages match wits with the best and the brightest and take their place in the pantheon of achievement, and it is all free. Before we start and I introduce the other panelists, I want to just take a moment to think about the people in Florida who are waiting out Hurricane Irma. What better day to be discussing all of the global implications of where we are in the world than with a nuclear hurricane bearing down on Florida. So first, Urvashi Butalia, you and I met at Jaipur, and I think of you as the reigning goddess of all India's women. As a founder of Kali and now Zubin Books, you have defined gender studies in India as a publisher and a thinker, and have written so searingly and magnificently about your own family's experience at another moment of extreme nationalism, the partition. You have had a feminist mother, you have won India's highest literary honor, the Padma Shri, and have observed that partition, like the Holocaust, is very much a living history. We will get into that later, but I also want to offer you an extra congratulations. Urvashi was at my house today for lunch. She'd just gotten on the plane from Berlin, where she has been given the Goethe Award from the German government for highest literary achievements. So congratulations, Urvashi. Bouchra Khalili, your work with refugees is so magnificent. Bouchra was raised between Morocco and France, studied film at the Sorbonne, is up at Radcliffe at the moment. Many of you here have seen her astonishing mapping project that was at MoMA for 6 months, and I have been so moved just learning about and seeing all of the haunting documentary subjects you have done in the last years, and as well your travels among the world's refugees. So Bruce Robbins, of course, is the absolute scholar of cosmopolitanism at Columbia and has written so many books, and you all know his work, and we're going to be getting to talk to Bruce in a moment. And then Eyal Weizman is our CSI representative, the forensic architect who uncovers every great human rights crime scene in the world. So, Eyal, it's an honor to be on the stage with you and Urvashi and Bruce and Bouchra. Let's plunge in. Let's make it simple. Let's do a fast round, each of you, and tell me what the new nationalism means to each of you and what you are observing in your country. So let's set the stage. And for you, what has been the most searing example that you can share from your country or your own lives? Bruce, let's start with you as our American. Where were you when you saw the horrifying images that came from Charlottesville, for example?
This may be the first time in my life I've been asked to speak as an American, but why not? I heard the news about Charlottesville in a very small village in the northern Peloponnese in Greece, which was a very weird experience because I felt very, very far away from something that it didn't feel good at all to feel far away from. But I thought afterwards that maybe there was some kind of benefit after all in being in this village of 300 people, an entirely agricultural village, no tourism whatsoever. I was told that a lot of the young people in this village are supporters of the Chrysi the Golden Dawn, which is the neo-Nazi movement in Greece. And I couldn't see that. And I couldn't see any difference looking at the people who had been pointed out to me as Chrysi. I couldn't see any difference in the degree of xenophobia or racism or whatever between them and anybody else. And that led me to think, and this is maybe the other side of spending a lot of time thinking about cosmopolitanism, that maybe it's a little bit too easy for us to point at the neo-Nazis and to think all of the dangerous nationalism is there. And it isn't in the kind of normal, commonsensical, liberal feelings that the rest of us carry around, those of us who are not Trump supporters, but maybe also don't speak up and in a sense facilitate things that we entirely disapprove of. if I could do a good Slovenian accent, I would do a Slavoj Žižek here on Game of Thrones and say, maybe the common sense in the liberal world is a little bit closer to a Game of Thrones version of nationalism than to a Donald Trump version. So not make America great again, meaning get rid of the foreigners, internal and external, who are stopping it from being great, which is the classical paradigm, but something closer to, I'm not saying my culture is any better than your culture. Everybody should follow their own cultures, but it's a jungle out there, and we're all fighting each other. And okay, if we happen to have superior air power in the form of dragons, well, so be it. This is a too high culture an audience. People don't get the Game of Thrones thing, but anyway. So that's what I thought.
You did a podcast yesterday, just continuing on, it's such an intriguing observation. You were on with an author who's just done the definitive book on Antifa. And can you tell us about Antifa as it now relates to the United States?
Well, yeah, the person I did a podcast with, his name is Mark Bray. He's been much talked about in the media. He has the first book on the international anti-fascist movement. It's a very controversial movement, as I'm sure people have heard, because they don't have much faith in the police or the state to protect people from the neo-Nazis, and therefore they are acting with physical force. And there are a lot of people who will just say any form of physical force puts you, basically justifies Trump in saying both sides, in creating a moral equivalence. And he, of course, fights the idea of moral equivalence very strongly and points out that most of what the anti-fascists do does not involve physical force. So I just give a plug to Mark Bray, Antifa, the anti-fascist handbook, just out from Melville House. It's a very good read and a very useful one. One thing that came out of the podcast was he does not think, as I do not think, that there is a real parallel between the 1920s and 30s when fascism arose in Europe and America right now. I wanted
to ask you about that.
And I was worried because there's certainly a number of people who are getting a little bit hysterical about that. I mean, Trump has let the lizards out from under their rocks and permitted a kind of discourse that is a bit shocking, I think, to a lot of us. But democracy, put it in quotation marks if you want, democracy in the US right now has a great deal more legitimacy than democracy had in Italy or Germany, say, in the 1920s and 1930s. And I don't actually think that we are in danger of the same kind of actual fascist takeover now that we saw happening then.
This is a good moment to spring from that beautiful phrase of yours, the lizards coming out from under the rocks, and give it to Urvashi. Urvashi, speaking of lizards, let's plunge in with this particular lizardy moment in your beautiful country and the unspeakable tragedy of the murder of Gowrie Lancash that has galvanized the world in the last 2 weeks. This extraordinary journalist who was brutally murdered in Bangalore was particularly horrifying for those of us who go to India frequently and love India, because you think, how could this be happening in Bangalore, the capital of high tech, the global garden city? How could this be happening? So could you reflect on this and as well the larger sense that you have of India at this moment?
So let me just give you, when you asked Bruce where he was when Charlottesville happened and what he thought about it, I was thinking back to 3 incidents, and very briefly, if I may tell you about them. So in February of this year, I was in Karachi attending a literature festival. There were about 7 or 8 writers, and we had consciously chosen to go there in the face of a lot of rhetoric between India and Pakistan about enemy country and so on and so forth. And in our absence, the media got hold of the names of the people who had gone there. And apparently there was a big furor in the press, on television, and we were all named and our pictures were put up saying, here are these Indian writers and they've gone to the enemy country to talk, as if we were doing something really terrible. And luckily, of course, India and Pakistan, your telephones don't work, so you can't communicate. So we didn't know this was happening until somebody pointed it out to me. And I was quite disturbed by that. Then subsequently came an incident that happened with a student of mine in Delhi, a young Muslim boy who started working with a magazine called Caravan, and who was sent out on an assignment to a place just on the outskirts of Delhi to report on the destruction by a group of Hindu right-wing people, but not only, of a structure that resembled a mosque. It was basically the villagers, which is a Hindu-Muslim mixed village, needed a place to pray and did not have a place and used to use the school. And then a rich Muslim or a wealthy Muslim said to them, build a 4-wall structure in my land and you can use that. So they did, and then this was destroyed. And this young boy was sent to report on it. He went about 10 days after. And he did all the right things. This is his first time assignment. He's 23. He went to the police, registered his name, and said, I've come to report on this. He went to the headman of the village, a Hindu, and said, I've come to report on this. And the headman invited him to a meeting. He went to the meeting. He was taking notes. Everybody knew that he was there. And then someone asked him his name. And he mentioned his name, and they realized he was a Muslim. And they nearly lynched him. They basically beat him up.
And this happened in Delhi,
it happened
the outskirts?
It happened in a place called Sonia Vihar, which is on the outskirts of Delhi.
Yes.
He was born in Kashmir, so he had an identity card, which has, as all Kashmiris have, their name and information in English and Urdu. And the moment they saw Urdu, they thought he was from Pakistan. So the police filed a report saying a man was found writing on this thing, and he was a Pakistani. That is it. The boy was so traumatized that he ran away from Delhi to his family in Kashmir, and he rang me from there to say, I've never lived here, I was only born here. And I've kind of been forced to come here. I hate it, I love Delhi, I want to be there. I'm a cosmopolitan, but this has happened to me. And then came Gauri's murder last week, when Gauri was killed in Bangalore by unidentified gunmen, a pattern of killings which is happened before. She's the 5th or 4th person to be thus killed. And in a sense, there is a kind of escalation of small incidents like this. And I emphasize the word small because I think, in a way, there is a kind of state policy to keep the small incidents happening but not allow big conflagration to happen, so that it doesn't seem like it's a cumulative process where things are going from bad to worse all the time. So state collusion or state support is one thing, but what is really worrying about all these incidents is the fact of public support or public, how should I say it, complicity,
And the complicity is of silence, that people aren't speaking out, that reporters are feeling muted, or that the chief minister is not speaking out. In Uttar Pradesh, when the man is lynched over his mutton. Is this the complicity, you mean?
I think it's all of those. It is a kind of public silence. It is a kind of, it's not to say there haven't been reactions. There have been very strong reactions, but even in the way that protests have happened, there is a sense of helplessness almost. And yet there is, I must say, there is a determination also that we can't let this continue to happen, that we have to deal with it. And Gauri's murder has really led to that in a very, very big way. But I think there is a complicity, there is a kind of terrible trolling on social media, and the articulation of the kinds of things that earlier would not have happened. And there is a kind of equivocal ambivalence on the part of our politicians, where they will not actively endorse, but not actively condemn, and will make a kind of balancing statement, just as Trump did on Charlottesville and things like that, which I think are very dangerous signs, and which is a very different kind of nationalism from the kind of what I think is a good nationalism that people like me grew up with, the first generation after independence. But we can talk about that later. So I think that's the sort of thing that's happening. The other thing that really disturbed, Gauri's death was really horrible, and she spoke out quite fearlessly. One of the things I think that also is quite, I don't know, disturbing or whatever the word is, it's the first time that they've targeted a woman. And there is a strange kind of way in which, because they don't take women that seriously, you know, in a sense, women were safe from this kind of attack. But now that that has been broken, I don't know really what that means. But
and a woman of tremendous stature with a real reverence for the Indian Constitution and for freedom of speech. And extraordinary. Do you feel that the Hindu nationalists are a danger to other Indians right now?
Do I feel that they're dangerous?
Yes. Are they these extraordinary, fierce nationalists in India are a danger to other Indians?
I think they are dangerous only because, well, for many reasons, but I think because violence has its own logic and life, and if every permissive attitude towards violence encourages it further, and I think that India has, for all its violence and everything, by and large, been a law-abiding country. And this really threatens at that also. So I worry about it also from that point of view, because the more you allow lawlessness to increase and grow and have tacit support from all quarters, the less it becomes possible to control it. So I think there's also that aspect to it that's quite worrying.
It's just extraordinarily interesting. Eyal, this is a perfect moment to pivot to you. Your work is just, I cannot say enough about it. It's like I felt like I was watching an episode of Fauda, the new Israeli series, when I was looking at your work on the web, and I've just come from the West Bank, as you and I have discussed. How did you start? Did you start in a period of violence in your country? Tell us about how you began, and as a way of contextualizing nationalism right now for you.
So if to start with nationalism, I think that a particular feature of Israeli nationalism is a nationalism with a borderline disorder. That is to say that it is not about a line beyond which there's the other, but a kind of radical entanglement. And in a situation like that, when you have a radical entanglement of those colonizing and the people living in a place, the Palestinians, you were in the West Bank, there's much that is asked of architecture to do. On the one hand, it needs to represent the difference between us and them. On the other hand, it needs also to function in kind of security rationale. It needs to create separation. It needs to create surveillance, etc. And all that needs to be read by being very tuned to the minute details of architecture. Why is that roof red? Why is the building looking and oriented like that, etc. And from there, the project of forensic architecture really began at the time of the first Intifada. And I remember in particular
You were then in your 20s?
I was in my late 20s. Mm-hmm. I was back in Israel, Palestine, after finishing my architectural degree. And I remember reading an article in the LRB by Edward Said asking for what he called the geographic turn. He said, in fact, Palestinians and those supporting Palestinians and fighting for Palestinian rights have neglected geography. We've left geography as the tool of the dominators. And he called for a certain counter-geography that included many things, both a kind of a sort of geography of daily life, but also a very straightforward mapping of the realities of the occupation. And I remember being very moved by that. And at the time, driving through the West Bank was rather precarious because it's sort of a patchwork territory of, you've been there, no? Of Israeli settlements and Palestinian villages and towns. And when you drive along the road during the time of the Intifada, it's, you don't know who is shooting at you at a particular situation. But we aim to create a document to, in fact, map for the first time the realities, the built realities of the occupation, and to look for something that we called crimes committed on the drawing board, this sort of bureaucratic human rights violation by the way that the settlements and the roads and the barriers and the infrastructure are laid out, and to see whether, to a certain extent, we could incriminate architects and planners in that form of domination. So this is how forensic architecture started, and now we're working. There's something also about the West Bank and in general Israel-Palestine that is such an intense and extreme situation that exhibits the symptoms that are very common in many other places. So it's a kind of a laboratory of the extreme, if you like. And
You've just been in Syria. Can you jump from that nationalism to your experience recently in Syria?
In Syria, we were in fact meeting Syrian refugees just across the border. And there were 5 survivors of one of the most horrific torture prisons in Syria, a place called Saidnaya, a place that was never photographed from inside. There's been no international visit, there's been no journalists, no Amnesty International, other groups were not there. And together with Amnesty, we thought to reconstruct the experience of being in that prison, in fact, the architecture of that prison, from the memories of those detainees.
Oh, interesting.
And something that became very apparent to us working on that is obviously that memory is not a very linear translation of experience to the way that you would articulate it. And in a sense, the most traumatic moments for those detainees, survivors in fact, were those that they could remember with the greatest difficulty, or at all not remember. And when you have willing witnesses that seek to reconstruct a memory of an event, working through the very mundane details of architecture, the width of corridors, the number of doors, the size of the floor tiles, the height of the windows, etc., allows all of the sudden memory also to be built together with the model, if you like, of the place that was built. So we did 2 things. We in fact exposed that the forms of torture, where that place is, how it looks from inside, etc., what was going on inside of it, and later showed that there were executions going on there on a sort of regular basis. But we also, with the survivors, allowed their memories to be gained again through that very, very slow process of architectural modeling.
So it's so interesting, this notion of the geography of the refugee and how the geography of the prisoner. We're in a world of refugees now. What do we have, Bouchra? 65 million refugees are in the world, right? It's just in the world at the moment. And when I just keep thinking about your absolutely beautiful mapping project and your sense, I'd love you to contextualize your sense of nationalism for you.
Well, we tend to believe that the number of refugees increased, but I'm not sure if it's true. It's maybe more visible, or maybe people started looking at it more in depth. As someone who was raised between France and Morocco, I have a sort of double experience of being at the same time the witness or someone who witnessed a a specific moment in Moroccan history that followed the Schengen Agreement in 1991, and that led somehow to a sort of collective obsession for leaving the country. Just to give a sense of context, before 1991, North African in general didn't need a visa to go to Europe. So we could go freely to Spain, France, not the UK, but at least France and Spain and those other Western European countries. And what was something, at that time I was a teenager, but however I was extremely surprised by this paradox. At the moment when Europeans were given the right to move freely within the border of the European Union, it was translated for us as a denial of a right of free mobility, as if a right given to European citizens had to be also a denial for others. And I guess, I mean, it's always difficult to connect or to link a work or a vision of thing that is translated into artwork in very biographical things, because I don't necessarily believe that because you grew up here or there, then you do this kind of work. However, it's something that I would never forget, how suddenly young boys in their early 20s, or even younger than that, trying to find ways to go out of the country, including risking their own lives, because crossing the Strait of Gibraltar is an extremely dangerous journey. But at the same time, because I am from Morocco, I also knew that the reason why they were leaving is because Morocco was not a democracy. So there was also a connection between, let's say, more rights given to European citizens and a non-democratic state that do not guarantee basic rights to its citizens. So what I also understood, I guess, at that time, and in which I still believe, is that there is maybe a need for redefining what does it mean to be a citizen. The same way that my work is often described as let's say, a practice related to refugees, the individuals with whom I work with, I didn't look at them as refugees. I look at them more as individuals who were forced to travel illegally for one reason or the other, because refugee has a legal meaning. It is a specific legal the definition, but personally I don't make a difference between someone who is living for economical reason and someone who is living for another reason. Could it be also political or because of a war? Because what I learned throughout the 15 years I have been working as an artist is that no one lives without a good reason for living. And no one engages in such dangerous journeys if you don't have a very good reason to do it. So, yeah, that's basically what I learned throughout the years working as an artist. I would say focusing on precisely how to elaborate or how to offer civic platforms where the question of citizenship and civic belonging can be redefined out of the model of the ethnic belonging that translates into a citizenship or a nationality or whatever. So in other words, it's also about trying to rethink what it means, what equality means. And if I may add something, I was quite moved when you mentioned the essay by Edward Said on counter-geography, because when I was working as an example on the Mapping Journey project, that's exactly what I had in mind. Because geography is history, right, translated into borders. Yeah.
So let's turn the coin a little bit. For our second round, could each of you just kind of quickly reflect on anti-globalization at this moment and how it triggers a kind of mounting parochialism in your countries, if you think it does, and who do you think is the most fragile community? What are the most fragile communities in your countries most likely to be affected? Bruce, hit it.
I'm not sure that I can answer that question as usefully for people as maybe I could continue Bouchra's point just now. I hope this won't seem like I'm standing in the way, but so I'm thinking again back to the question that brings us here, what we think nationalism is. And I think it's easy to think of nationalism in its extreme forms. And it's a little harder to think of the brand of nationalism that would say, resist a large number of the people you don't want to call refugees coming in. They would say, I'm not racist, I'm not xenophobic, but a country just can't stand to have too many people who are culturally different, who don't speak the language, and so on. So what if we were to think that those are the people that we really need to work on, not the people who are throwing Molotov cocktails into...
But those who are feeling vulnerable,
well,
or feeling
who
a
are,
sense
who are
of
feeling vulnerable,
precariousness.
or what kind of moral argument would work on that kind of nationalism?
Many people
So,
are trying to grapple with this very concept.
And I have a book coming out which doesn't answer that question at all, but it makes a...
Can we order it on Amazon?
It takes a shot. And I get a pretty good percentage of the sales. I won't even mention the title. But the idea of it is, what if we could present the flow of people that, maybe migrants, maybe refugees, maybe just individuals, and we could erase a little bit the line between migrants who are merely economically motivated and refugees who are supposed to be motivated by violence, and say everybody's got a good reason, as you were just saying. Well, and one of those reasons is the history of things that the receiving countries have done in the countries that are sending. That we in the receiving countries are beneficiaries of, how shall I say, economic surplus that has been siphoned off from these countries, and acts of violence, of course, under colonialism. So in a sense, it's a version of, we are here because you were there, but it's a very up-to-date version. It's not just about colonialism. It's about, you are benefiting now from a system which has been screwing people in these places. And the fact that they're coming has to do with that. So don't you feel morally a little bit more motivated to open your doors if it's not just humanitarianism toward other human beings, but you are responsible morally for the causes of their desire to depart. Anyway, that's the premise.
It's called utopian. It's creating the new utopia, to retitle it.
I'm just trying to make people feel really guilty.
Urvashi, what do you think is causing the sense of precariousness in India right now? And how is it possible to better engage with it, if it's possible, and have a better outcome, as Bruce is suggesting? Is there a way to understand what the masses are feeling? A better way to understand and reach out?
I think that's a really big question, but...
That's what we like here.
I mean, in a sense, what we call globalization is something that's always been happening, because there has always been travel and trade and exchange and so on and so forth. But in the way in which we understand it today, in the post-nation-state creation scenario, I think there's a sort of inherent contradiction between the self-imagination of the nation-state. I hate making big statements, but just for once, the self-imagination of the nation-state and the way it sees its boundaries, etc., and globalization, and the fact that most nation-states have had to globalize, and they've not really thought or dealt with this issue. So for India at the moment, there is also, India imagines itself now as a superpower, as the biggest democracy in the world, as somebody who is no longer caught in the binaries of the Cold War, but is a nation engaging with the multipolar world, or whatever you call it. And yet it's caught in these terrible nationalisms, and it's also caught in this, I mean, the latest example of the kind of violence that a refugee movement can create is the entry of small numbers of Rohingyas into India.
Well, I spent the weekend, as I told you at lunch today, reading your astonishing book about your family's experience in the partition, and I was so moved by it that I immediately went on demand and watched this new movie, The Viceroy House, and once again was simply horrified by this fact that all the migrations, all the killings, the 1 million people who lose their lives, is it feeling for you and other members of the panel that India is going back to that sort of absolute nationalist, post-colonial, whatever you would call that terrible violence of the partition, that anger between minorities, populations?
No, I think the short answer to that is no. I think the migration that happened at partition was fueled by many things. Fueled by fear, the uncertainty of what was going to happen. People don't expect nations to break up around them. They don't expect that they will have to change their homes overnight, and they don't even believe it. You know, who would believe it? If we were told tomorrow that we had to move out of X place, one wouldn't really believe it. And that happens with natural disasters and all sorts of things. So I think that the migration at that time was fueled by all of these things, and including the process of decolonization and the formation of 2 new countries. I think that at this time what's happening, there is definitely a sort of throwback reference to what happened at that time, but it's not on a mass scale, and I think what's happening is that people are fearful. People are fearful that things may change so drastically in a country which has broadly been democratic and broadly had an incomplete but nevertheless a sort of shambolically functioning democracy.
With so many languages and so many religions.
Yes, all of those things. So there is this real fear that we might descend into something that we really don't want to go into. But I think there's also a strong sense of commitment that we can't let this happen. We can't let this happen, and that whatever it takes, we have to fight it. So I think that that's also happening at the same time. But I would say that what's happening is, while it references the sort of fear that we had at partition, it's not the same thing.
Eyal, do you want to jump in with what you're observing?
Yes, perhaps I can say that my imagination of globalization has transformed quite radically in recent years. So I used to think of it as there is a ground, whatever, a globe perhaps, and it's solid, and then things move across it. Globalization, refugees move within it. But it seems to me increasingly now that it is the ground itself that is moving underneath all those barriers and all those divisions that we are actually kind of parcellating the globe with. What do I mean? I was following in recent years, the movements, the fluctuations of the threshold of the desert, not only in Israel-Palestine, but across the entire Middle East and then onwards in East Asia. And you see that first of all, I think a category of the need to move or the want to move is going to increasingly be climate refugees now. And that is not because people are moving, it's the planet that is moving underneath them, right? So if you are living in an area that was more or less close to the threshold of the desert, but still within fields, and all of a sudden the desert has kind of shot up like 200 kilometers, I don't know who is moving. You're moving or the earth is moving underneath you. And I think that kind of, you're saying what is the sort of the most disturbing form of anti-globalization is the thought that these kind of issues are local and could be dealt within a sort of single sovereign system, and the hardening of that, especially in the US. So what we see, I mean, when we look at those sequence of hurricanes now, like hitting the southern coast, it feels almost the earth is moving.
Yes.
Right? And those people that need to move out of Florida are, whether they cross an international border or not. Like you, I don't care whether, in the kind of the UN legal definition of who is a refugee or not. Those are people that need to leave their homes, right? And they are climate refugees, and there are climate refugees in this country now, and there will be increasingly so.
So let's throw into the mix the whole notion of the web. And so I have a macro question for the panel, which is, Neil Ferguson is out with a new book, which is extraordinarily interesting, and he suggests in this book about, which many people have observed, but let me just quote, "The utopian visions of a networked world were at odds with everything we know about how social networks work." In other words, the nature of the new social networks has engendered some of the very challenges: unemployment, inequality, authoritarianism, and no company did more to help the populace win their political victories in the United States than Facebook with its over 1 billion users. So can you all reflect on this for me and how this for you is playing into nationalism as you're observing it, and what are you noticing of how the web is either harming or helping your individual work? Bouchra, you want to lead off?
I'm not a user of social networks, but sometimes I'm an observer, and somehow it's not disconnected to what Bruce was saying before, and maybe I can continue on that. And this time I would speak as a French citizen and as an observer of the situation in France, even though I live in Berlin, Germany. What I have observed throughout the years is how the language of the nationalist parties and their supporters have changed. And somehow, if you go back to the history of how this movement structured itself in the last 40 years, and they have openly said it, there is a sort of change in terms of strategy. Obviously, they have quite smart people there in France, and I'm thinking of one in particular called Alain de Benoit, who in the late 70s started reading in depth Antonio's Gramsci writing, and he realized that it would be extremely useful for them, because what was eventually at stake was to win a cultural hegemony and to build up a cultural hegemony. And the cultural hegemony that they needed was first needed in terms of language, forcing the people to speak their language and spreading that language all around the society at different levels. The media played a major role in France because they started inviting intellectuals who were basically from that side, who were using exactly the same strategy and who were pretending to speak on behalf of the French who were not represented and who were basically the ones being scared of globalization and all those foreign people who would soon replace them. Because it's also a quite popular concept in France, this idea of the great replacement. And when I saw the images and the footage of Charlottesville, I thought of them immediately, because it was exactly the same rhetoric and the same strategy, and reversing the wording to speak of their own situation and turning themselves into the underrepresented minorities. And of course, I don't know what are the connections, but most probably the social media played a role, because those influencers and those intellectuals use it extensively and have a very wide audience.
The fake footage that have been at the center of so much of the recent violence in France. You know, the extraordinary rise of social media in France, and I have been very impressed, though, with French law enforcement shutting down these sites, and the web being sued in France to be shutting down these sites. What about you, Eyal? What are you noticing? You've just been in Mexico doing a fascinating case. Does the web play into that case at all that you've done in Mexico? And what can you tell us about that?
Well, we just launched our investigation of the 43 disappeared students in Ayotzinapa. And what we've done is collect enormous amount of data in relation to basically data mining, a lot of state reports, human rights reports, testimonies of survivors from this event that I'm sure all of you know, where students from kind of a radical Marxist school, rural school in Mexico drove into a town and were decimated, and their traces have disappeared there. So we were given access. We were asked really by the NGO that represents the families of the disappeared to take another look at the evidence, precisely because the police was no help. Police was the perpetrator of that event and the organization in charge of investigating it. So that was strange and no good. What we've done is basically synchronize all phone calls, movement of cars, gunshots, other movements and communication across the city in order to see collusion and coordination. And all of a sudden, through a kind of a web-based approach, we could start seeing very clearly the coordination between the military, the municipal police, the federal police, municipal polices from other municipalities, and how that violence actually start escalating and radicalizing as a feature of communication.
And in a way, it brings us full circle, because what I take away from your investigation in Mexico, which, by the way, is on the cover of Intercept magazine, published yesterday, is the sense that the law has ceased to exist, which is, can we say, what unites our terror of ultranationalism, that laws, whether in America, are no longer going to be observed, that the courts will be ignored, that the Mexican authorities will trump everything by just becoming their own lawless factor, in everywhere, in India and in this country, in France. So this is, for me, certainly as a reporter, the most terrifying aspect of the ultranationalism that we are all so terrified of. But before we go to questions, I just want to turn the telescope briefly and talk about the notion of nationalism as a positive effect. I mean, I think we're seeing nationalism. The legal philosopher Moshe Halbertal said yesterday in an email, the fact is nationalism isn't necessarily a bad word. You have a nationalism which supports its minority communities, which supports its laws, which makes a society, in the best sense, be a kind of haven, a haven society of law. And I think we've seen something that was very positive in the last few weeks in America when Hurricane Harvey hit Houston, and you saw this outpouring across all minorities, with the mayor saying there will be no problem picking up anyone who might have been considered a, quote, illegal in its other sense. And today, as Florida is facing down Irma, can we just reflect on this in our various societies, the positive aspects of nationalism that you're seeing in your societies in the best sense?
Well, I think if you compare it to feudalism, it's probably an improvement, but I cannot see much. Sorry.
No, I don't know how much you want us to say about this. I disagree with Neil Ferguson, but I believe I've disagreed with everything that Neil Ferguson has ever said on any subject. And, maybe what we're talking about here is, I can sort of twist this a little bit and say there is a kind of libertarian individualistic ethic which is sometimes associated with social media, certainly which is associated with some of the big computer companies, digital companies. And you can see the positive side of nationalism by contrast with that. Those moments of solidarity, let's say over hurricane victims, you know, and the willingness to support social welfare for people who share residence with you, you know, which is, of course, not internationalist enough, but it's also not that kind of, I only care about myself, the libertarian individualism, which I think is digitally being manufactured more than the kinds of solidarities that Ferguson says he's so scared of.
Urvashi?
I'm thinking about your question, and I'm not, I mean, part of me wants to believe that the kind of nationalism that we grew up with in post-independence India, which was subscribing to an idea that was inclusive and diverse and rich with that diversity, and which recognized the marginalizations of caste and of region and of minoritism and all of those things, was a model of nationalism that enriched us. But even as I say this, I also, part of me questions the idea of nationalisms, even though I don't know of a structure that can function better than the existing nation states that we have. I mean, you talked of utopia earlier, and I don't know how to imagine that kind of utopia beyond what we know, which is the nation state. But the way in which I see the nation state functioning where I live now, where it marginalizes those who are the most vulnerable and the poorest, so the tribals, the lower caste, the minorities, the women, I'm not sure that, you know, I mean, were we just blind when we imagined the early nation state and thought that it's not going to do this? Or has it changed radically? And is this something we now have to completely reject and imagine something different? I don't really know. But when we were talking earlier of migrations and when you posed the question about globalization, I was thinking of the ways in which global corporations have hit the most vulnerable people in India and taken over their lands, and the state, the nation, has colluded in that for the sake of money, and it is as if then the whole notion of citizenship disappears because only the wealthy and the privileged...
And law.
Exactly,
and law,
yeah.
As in Mexico.
So, I don't know, I don't have an easy answer to that, but it is a really troubling question.
Yes. So with that, I want to thank my panel and say that we hope that we can all become a global nation, pledging our loyalty to the planet as these various floods and hurricanes and political hurricanes overwhelm us. And who has questions for our panel?
I grown up in country where nationalism certainly had only negative connotation. It means pogroms, massacre, hate. Still, I wonder of your opinion. White race right now probably feel itself master of universe. Reality is less than 10% of world population. Rate of birth 1.7.8. It means to distinguish, to disappear. For simple reproduction, you need 2.2. In the same time, little nation surrounded, let's say, by billion people who hate with passion this nation and would stop only under conditions as this nation and their country would disappear. How such nation can survive without...
So your question, sir, is what?
So my question is, how you would see, let's say, white nationalism who try to protect Western civilization from distinguished.
I couldn't understand. Did anyone understand the question?
Or even white race, white race itself, less than 10% of world population, and decrease in every possible way, cannot reproduce itself anymore.
Can I say something? The name of my friend and mentor, Edward Said, has come up a couple of times, and I don't want to allow that to happen without me also mentioning it. So I'll just say, he was a very important teacher for me about, I think, that question, in the sense that he was not a fan of nationalism at all, and indeed was accused of idealizing a form of exile from the nation as a necessary condition of artistic or intellectual work. And he never stopped fighting for the self-determination of the Palestinian people. So if maybe there's a contradiction there, or maybe he's answering your question, saying the Palestinians are in a situation in which they have to deal with the violence and coercion of people who don't want them to have a nation, and those who disagree, including the Palestinians themselves, are going to have to struggle to make sure that they get one. I don't know if that's exactly what you're asking, but anyway, that's the closest I can come.
Next question. Second row.
At its core, nationalism is about people who are intolerant of differences. So you could have a situation where if people are different, you could take the view, I don't trust you, I don't know you, and you may be a threat. Alternatively, if people are different, you could take the view, you're different, you fascinate me, let me learn something about you. So that difference, depending on whether you're low-minded or high-minded, can translate to very different behaviors. As Urvashi said, when India was born, it was born in a very good, high-minded way, where this was a country which had nothing to bind it together. It was very idealistic. But then the low-mindedness sets in, and really the antidote to nationalism is high-mindedness. And how to promote that would be something that...
So your question is, when did high-mindedness become a dirty word? Like, when did cosmopolitanism become a dirty word?
Well, my question is, how would you promote high-mindedness?
Okay, in the more positive sense.
Yeah.
How do we make high-mindedness not seem like an elitist concept that sets off a trigger reaction to parochialism, in other words? It's an interesting question. Who wants to jump on that one? Eyal.
Oh, appropriately hard question for me. I think if I may return to your question and then perhaps open to yours, is to say that nationalism is sometimes a strategic response to various other forms of repression, such as feudalism or colonialism, etc. But what need to be articulated even through struggle is the definition of the nation as something that is not exclusively and hermetically bound. And here again, the question of Palestine, and who is Palestinian? Who is a Palestinian to be liberated could be articulated on an ethnic or linguistic borders, but it could be articulated in a very different way. Who is feeling repressed? Who is repressed in a particular situation, in that situation? Who can identify with an alternative to precisely the ethnically bound nation kind of national arrangement, national geographical arrangement that would be imposed either as part of the problem or as part of the solution, i.e. the two-state solution, right? So the question is really not so much is nationalism the problem, it is what is really holds it together. What could we develop its own, could that project develop its own borderline disorder? And in that way, I think that it's not necessarily high-mindedness, no? I mean, it is actually a concept that I think, or an attitude that needs to cut across rather than somehow become an elitist discourse, an elitist sort of, so that the entry into that definition of the nation, which is not ethnically bound, is not bound to some form of elitism.
If I may just add a question to you, I don't necessarily think difference and trust go together in the kind of way that you have described it. I mean, why would you say somebody who's not different from you, you trust them, and somebody who's different from you, you don't trust them? In the way that you articulated it, see, but you don't necessarily trust them. They could be terrible. You know, I mean, they could be crooks. Look at all, I mean, I'm born a Hindu, unfortunately. I don't trust any of those guys who are going around killing. Sorry?
Them in the abstract.
In the abstract, I mean, where? So, for example, sorry, someone was saying something. When you talked, I was thinking of Indian Kashmir, or whatever you call it. The battle for self-determination there, it's exactly the same thing. Where is the ideal Kashmiri community that will ensure the happiness of its citizens? And is it within the geographical space? Or is it actually spread all over the country, or is it elsewhere? And will that ideal Kashmiri community actually make space for all its minorities and for its women and so on? You know, you don't know. It's this dream of the ideal place, but it's
and to turn the question sort of inside out a little bit before we close, what is the responsibility of our country's leaders to be the moral arbiters of this? I mean, I've been absolutely fascinated that in this panel, no one has mentioned the name Donald Trump.
Thanks God.
Who's that?
For the entire hour. But I mean, what is the responsibility of our various leaders? Is it a chicken and egg situation? If you have leaders who are essentially shredding public discourse and acting like the strongmen, the Kim Jong-un playing with their phallic rockets in our various countries, does that create this problem? In other words, does it then fuel the problem, or does the problem create these leaders? Anyone want to weigh in on this in the audience?
No, I have a different question.
Okay, go ahead with your question. I'm sure it's better.
Me? Recreating ideas of belonging. I know, Bouchra, when I saw your mapping project for the first time, I don't remember where in the world it was exactly, but I was really struck by how intimate it was, like this process of storytelling and like going through the journey, and I can see how that has the potential of like kind of just looking at narrative and looking at where you're coming from and where you're going and why. And I think there was really interesting like nuances about language in many of these interviews. So you can answer the question if you want. Like, is the role of art in that very intimate space of you working one-on-one with someone, or can art have like a larger societal or cultural role to play? Thank you.
There are different questions in your question, actually. First of all, they are not interviews. They are accounts that were developed by the participants themselves throughout very long conversations. So what you heard and sounded to you so intimate was actually the result of our conversation that I often describe as a writing without writing, because it's actually about taking possession of one's own word and delivering very singular account, which in my opinion can embody also collective voices. And the art space is also that space where those singular voices becomes collective voices. That's one part of your question. The other one is actually maybe more linked to the question of nationalism in a way. As you know, I come from Morocco. And for me, nationalism is somehow a sort of failure when you link it to the history of independence in North Africa. Because the history of independence of North African countries was essentially the result of international solidarity. Of course, it had to rely on the discourse that we form a nation, we are a people, we have one culture, one language. But for people who are familiar with North Africa, we all know it's not true, because we speak different languages. Most of them are vernacular languages, and there is an extraordinary diversity of populations there. However, the movement of independence needed to rely on the idea that there are borders, there are different peoples. I know it's not true because I've spent 2 months in Algeria, and I was speaking Moroccan dialect, and I could perfectly communicate with with the Algerians I met there. So the reason why in those works, and in actually all of my works in videos, one can hear different dialects, it's actually not about question of nationalism, it's actually about the opposite. It's actually because what we call nation state is only a restrictive conception of identity that does not reflect the reality in which we live. And somehow that reality has to be reflected in the works. So I guess this answers your question.
And a wonderful place to end. Very, very good. Thank you so much, panel, and thank you for coming, and much to come.
Thank you so much, Marie, for this wonderful session, and Eyal, Bouchra, Bruce, and Urvashi for coming all the way. At Jaipur, at JLF, we really believe that it's platforms like this that bring people together and get us a better understanding of different cultures, of different people, and perhaps make sense of the very divisive world that we live in. On behalf of Namita Gokhale, our festival director, and my colleagues, Preeta and Kritika, just to say thank you all very much. Thank you to MoMA, to Stuart, and to Jay, and to Sean and their colleagues. It's a wonderful relationship that we have, both here and back in India. To our Consulate General here in New York, thank you for all the support. Sandeep, unfortunately, is not here. He's trying to fight Hurricane Irma in, I think, Atlanta. Mr. Chakravarti is here. Paramita, thank you very much for being here. Professor, it's an honor to have you here. Thank you all very much, and good night. Hope to see you all in JLF at Boulder, which opens next weekend, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And if not, come to India. The main Jaipur Literature Festival is 25th to the 29th of January 2018. Thank you all, and good night.